Something has shifted, and Washington knows it. China has reportedly handed Iran hypersonic anti-ship missiles, and these are not ordinary weapons. These are systems specifically engineered to hunt and destroy US aircraft carriers, the very symbols of American military dominance that have patrolled the Persian Gulf for decades, projecting power, enforcing order, and reminding the world who holds the stick. Now, let's be precise about what this actually means, because the headlines will sensationalize it and the Pentagon will downplay it. The truth sits somewhere more uncomfortable than either. For 70 years, the aircraft carrier has been the centerpiece of US foreign policy, not just militarily, but psychologically. When a crisis erupts, Washington sends a carrier group. That signal alone has ended conflicts before they began. But a hypersonic missile traveling at speeds that outrun every existing defense system changes that calculation entirely. It doesn't just threaten a ship, it threatens the credibility of the threat itself. And that is where power structures actually collapse, not in the explosion, but in the moment the bluff is called. So let's go back to the beginning, because context is everything. And without it, this story is just another alarming headline that people scroll past on their phones between coffee and commute. To understand why this reported transfer of hypersonic anti-ship missiles from China to Iran is so significant, you have to understand the architecture of power that has governed this planet since the end of World War II. You have to understand what the United States built, why it built it, and what it means when that structure begins to show cracks that can no longer be plastered over with diplomatic language and press briefings. After 1945, the United States emerged from the rubble of a global war as the singular economic and military giant on the planet. Europe was devastated. The Soviet Union had lost over 20 million people. Asia was shattered. And into that vacuum stepped American capital, American institutions, and American military reach. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. American naval power patrolled the sea lanes through which global trade flowed. And at the center of that naval power sat the aircraft carrier, a floating city of destruction capable of projecting devastating force anywhere on Earth within days. This was not accidental. This was architecture. This was a deliberate construction of a world system in which American power was the enforcing mechanism. And for decades, it worked. Not perfectly, not morally in every instance, but functionally. The system held. Now, here is where people often get confused. They think of military power as purely about fighting wars, but the deeper function of military power, especially naval power, is about what economists call credible commitment. It is the ability to make a threat that your adversary genuinely believes you will carry out. When the United States sailed carrier groups into the Taiwan Strait in 1996 in response to Chinese military exercises, Beijing backed down. Not because a war was fought, but because the threat was credible. The carrier was real, the firepower was undeniable, and China at that moment had no answer to it. That is how dominance actually functions. It functions through the psychology of inevitability. And that is precisely what China appears to be systematically dismantling, one technological transfer at a time, one diplomatic alignment at a time, one economic agreement at a time. What we are watching is not simply an arms deal. We are watching a coordinated geopolitical strategy that has been unfolding for well over a decade, and the hypersonic missile transfer to Iran, if confirmed, is one more deliberate piece of that larger puzzle. Let's talk about hypersonic weapons specifically, because the word gets thrown around in news segments without people really grasping what the technology represents. A conventional missile, even a fast one, travels on a predictable trajectory. It goes up, it comes down, and modern naval defense systems like the Aegis combat system aboard US destroyers are extraordinarily effective at tracking, calculating, and intercepting those trajectories. The entire layered defense architecture around a US carrier strike group is built on the assumption that incoming threats move in ways that can be predicted and therefore countered. Hypersonic missiles break that assumption entirely. They travel at speeds exceeding Mach 5, which is 5 times the speed of sound, and they do not follow predictable ballistic paths. They maneuver, they glide, they change direction at speeds that give defense systems almost no time to respond. The window between detection and impact shrinks from minutes to seconds, and in those seconds, the most expensive and strategically vital naval asset in the history of human warfare becomes something closer to a target. Now, does that mean a single hypersonic missile sinks a carrier? Not necessarily. The United States has been developing countermeasures, and no weapon system is a guaranteed kill. But here is the point that military strategists actually care about, and this is where Richard Wolff's framework of power analysis becomes genuinely illuminating. It is not about whether the missile definitely destroys the carrier. It is about whether American military planners can still say with confidence that a carrier strike group can operate freely in, for example, the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea within range of Iranian-held weapons without accepting an unacceptable level of risk to a $2 billion vessel and the 5,000 human beings aboard it. The moment that confidence wavers, the strategic calculus changes, and the strategic calculus changing is the same as power shifting. Think about what Iran's geography looks like in relation to these waters. The Persian Gulf is essentially a narrow corridor. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes, is at its narrowest point, only about 21 miles wide. For decades, US carriers have operated in and around these waters as an implicit guarantee of free navigation and as a constant message to Tehran. We are here, we are watching, and there is nothing you can do about it. That message has shaped Iranian foreign policy, Iranian domestic politics, and the broader regional balance of power for a generation. But now imagine Iranian forces equipped with hypersonic anti-ship missiles positioned along their coastline in underground silos, on mobile launchers that can be moved and concealed. The calculation for a US admiral commanding a carrier group in that region transforms overnight. You are no longer projecting invulnerability. You are accepting exposure. And that exposure is political as much as it is military. This brings us to China. And we need to spend serious time here because the American media coverage of China tends to oscillate between two equally unhelpful poles. On one side, you have the hawks who treat every Chinese action as part of a master plan for world domination, which produces hysteria rather than analysis. On the other side, you have the voices that consistently underestimate the degree to which Beijing is engaged in a long-term, patient strategic challenge to the post-war American order. The truth is more sober and more structurally grounded than either narrative. China is a rising capitalist power, and I want to be precise about that word, capitalist, because it matters, that has accumulated enormous economic weight and is now translating that economic weight into geopolitical leverage exactly the way rising powers have always done throughout history. This is not mysterious. This is not a conspiracy. This is the historical pattern of how hegemonic transitions unfold, and it is uncomfortable for Americans to reckon with because American political culture has largely treated US global dominance as a permanent and natural condition rather than as a historically contingent one. China's decision to reportedly supply Iran with hypersonic anti-ship missiles did not happen in isolation. It is part of a broader strategic relationship between Beijing and Tehran that has been deepening for years. In 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement that included economic investment, infrastructure development, and security cooperation. That agreement was worth, by various estimates, around $400 billion of Chinese investment in Iran over that period. In exchange, China secured preferential access to Iranian oil and gas, a critical input for the Chinese economy, and Iran received a powerful patron capable of blunting the worst effects of American sanctions. This is not charity. This is strategic economics operating at the state level. China gets energy security and a regional partner capable of complicating US military planning. Iran gets capital, technology, and the protective diplomatic shadow of a permanent UN Security Council member that will veto the most punishing international measures Washington might otherwise pursue. And now, layered on top of that economic architecture, comes the weapons transfer. This is the military dimension of a relationship that already has deep economic roots. And this is where American policymakers face a genuinely difficult structural problem that no amount of sanctions or strongly worded statements can easily resolve. The United States has spent decades using economic pressure as its primary tool for managing Iran. Sanctions have been devastating to the Iranian economy. They have produced real hardship for ordinary Iranian people, but they have not produced the fundamental change in Iranian behavior that Washington sought, in part because China has provided Iran with an economic lifeline that partially cushions the blow. And now, if China is additionally providing Iran with weapons technology that directly challenges American military superiority in the region, the entire sanctions-based strategy begins to look not just ineffective, but structurally obsolete. You cannot sanction your way to dominance when the country you are pressuring has a $400 billion partnership with the second largest economy on Earth. Let's zoom out even further, because this story connects to something even larger that is reshaping the entire architecture of global power. We are living through what scholars of international relations would describe as a period of hegemonic transition, a moment in history when the dominant power of an era faces a serious structural challenge from a rising competitor. These transitions are historically the most dangerous moments in international politics. They have produced wars throughout history precisely because the declining power is reluctant to accept its relative diminishment, and the rising power is impatient with the constraints imposed upon it by a system it did not build and which was not designed to serve its interests. The United States built the post-war international order. The dollar system, the military alliances, the trade institutions, the naval dominance, all of it was constructed to serve American interests while providing enough benefit to allies to maintain their cooperation. China entered that system as a rising manufacturing power and used it brilliantly to accumulate wealth. But China has never been a full ideological or strategic stakeholder in that system. And as Chinese power has grown, the divergence between China's interests and the interests of the American-built order has become increasingly visible and increasingly consequential. What is happening with Iran is a direct expression of that divergence. From China's perspective, a United States capable of freely projecting carrier-based air power into the Persian Gulf is a United States capable of threatening Chinese energy supply lines, Chinese trade routes, and Chinese strategic partners. Weakening that American capability, or at least raising the costs and risks associated with exercising it, is entirely consistent with China's long-term strategic interest. And providing a regional partner like Iran with the tools to complicate American military planning achieves that strategic objective without China having to directly confront the United States militarily, which Beijing is not yet ready and not yet willing to do. This is sophisticated statecraft. It is the use of a proxy relationship to advance strategic objectives while maintaining plausible deniability and avoiding the direct risks of great power confrontation. And it deserves to be analyzed on those terms rather than reduced to either villainy or triviality. Meanwhile, inside the United States, this kind of structural analysis is remarkably absent from mainstream political discourse. The dominant response in Washington to news like this tends to follow a familiar pattern. There are congressional hearings. There are calls for additional sanctions on China. There are statements about the ironclad commitment to regional security. There are demands that allies step up. And then the news cycle moves on, and the underlying structural dynamics continue to unfold exactly as they were before the hearings and the statements and the demands. This is not because American policymakers are stupid. Many of them are extraordinarily intelligent and genuinely dedicated people. It is because the political system within which they operate is structurally ill-equipped to grapple with long-term systemic challenges. American politics operates on 2-year and 4-year electoral cycles. Hegemonic transitions operate on decade and generational timescales. That mismatch produces a persistent tendency toward reactive tactical responses to what are fundamentally strategic and structural problems. And there is a deeper economic dimension here that almost never gets discussed in the cable news coverage of these military stories. The United States has maintained its global military dominance at extraordinary financial cost. The American defense budget is larger than the next several countries combined, maintaining carrier strike groups, forward basing thousands of troops across the Middle East and East Asia, running the intelligence and surveillance infrastructure that undergirds American global reach. All of this costs money, staggering amounts of money, and that money comes from somewhere. It comes from a dollar system that allows the United States to run large deficits and print money in ways that other countries simply cannot, because the dollar is the reserve currency and there is always global demand for it. But that dollar privilege is itself dependent on the credibility of American power. If American power becomes less credible, if carriers can no longer freely operate in contested waters, if regional partners begin hedging toward Beijing, if the costs of maintaining military reach begin to exceed the political will to pay them, then the whole interconnected system begins to weaken. The military credibility and the economic privilege are not separate stories. They are the same story told from two different angles. This is what makes the reported Chinese transfer of hypersonic anti-ship missiles to Iran more than a regional military story. It is a data point in a larger transformation of global economic and political architecture that will define the coming decades. Every time a US adversary or competitor acquires technology that meaningfully complicates American power projection, the implicit global bargain that underlies dollar hegemony and American-led institutions shifts incrementally. No single event tips the scales, but the accumulation of events, each one individually manageable, begins to constitute something qualitatively different, something structural. And structural changes, once they reach a certain threshold, are extraordinarily difficult to reverse through any combination of sanctions, military spending, or diplomatic pressure. Now let's bring this closer to home, because there are real Americans, working people, military families, people paying attention to gas prices and grocery bills, for whom all of this might seem abstract and distant. It is not. The global order that American power has sustained, for all its profound moral contradictions and failures, has also produced specific material conditions that Americans experience in their daily economic lives. The relatively stable flow of oil through the Persian Gulf affects energy prices everywhere. The ability of American companies to operate globally and access markets across the world is underwritten by a diplomatic and military infrastructure. The dollar's status as the reserve currency means that the United States borrows money at lower interest rates than virtually any other country on earth, a benefit that flows in complicated and often invisible ways into the daily economic life of ordinary Americans. When that infrastructure is challenged, when those conditions begin to shift, the consequences eventually land on Main Street, even when they originate in the Strait of Hormuz. And the communities that feel this most acutely, most immediately, are military communities, because behind every strategic abstraction about carrier vulnerability and hypersonic kill chains, there are real people. There are sailors and pilots and support crew who serve aboard those carriers. There are families in Norfolk and San Diego and Bremerton who wait for their loved ones to come home from deployments in precisely the waters that are now more contested than they were. The dehumanizing tendency of geopolitical analysis is to discuss weapon systems and kill probabilities without ever pausing to reckon with the human weight of what those abstractions actually mean. A hypersonic missile that creates strategic ambiguity in the Persian Gulf is also a weapon system that is specifically designed to kill thousands of American service members in a single strike. That reality should be part of this conversation. It almost never is. What would a serious American response to this development actually look like? That is the question that Washington will struggle with, and struggle with it inadequately if history is any guide. A serious response would require acknowledging the structural nature of the challenge, that this is not a problem that can be solved by designating a few more Chinese entities on a sanctions list or by deploying an extra carrier group to the region as a show of force. A serious response would require rethinking the entire framework of American engagement with the Middle East, with China, and with the global economic architecture that has served American interests for 80 years, but which is now under sustained and sophisticated challenge. It would require political leaders willing to have honest conversations with the American public about the nature of the moment we are in, not the reassuring fictions about American strength and adversary weakness that have characterized so much official communication, but the sober acknowledgement that the world is changing, that power is shifting, and that managing that shift wisely and peacefully requires a quality of strategic thinking and public honesty that is in very short supply in contemporary Washington. The deeper tragedy here is that the United States retains enormous assets, technological, economic, demographic, institutional, and yes, military. The challenges are real, but they are not insurmountable. What makes them feel insurmountable is the gap between the scale of the structural challenge and the poverty of the political response. When every complex geopolitical development gets filtered through the lens of the next election cycle, when every difficult strategic conversation gets reduced to partisan point scoring, when the genuine interests of working Americans in a stable and peaceful world get subordinated to the interests of defense contractors and financial institutions and political donors, then the capacity to respond wisely to moments like this one atrophies. And that atrophy is ultimately more dangerous than any hypersonic missile. Because here is the thing that never makes the headlines, but that sits at the core of this entire situation. The contest between the United States and China is not fundamentally a military contest. It is a contest over which model of organizing society and economy can better deliver for ordinary people over the coming decades. It is a contest over whose institutions are more legitimate, whose promises are more credible, whose vision of global order is more sustainable. Military power matters in that contest, but it is downstream of economic vitality, of social cohesion, of the genuine well-being of ordinary citizens, and a United States that cannot build adequate housing, cannot provide universal health care, cannot maintain crumbling infrastructure, cannot educate its children without burying them in debt, that United States is losing the deeper contest regardless of how many carrier strike groups it deploys. The hypersonic missiles are real. The strategic implications are real. The shift in global power architecture is real. And the response that is most urgently needed is not more weapons spending, not more sanctions, not more carrier deployments into increasingly contested waters. The most urgently needed response is a clear-eyed, structurally honest reckoning with what is actually happening to American power and why, and a democratic conversation about what kind of role the United States actually wants to play in a world that is no longer organized around unipolar American dominance. That conversation is long overdue, and every development like this one Every reported weapons transfer, every new strategic alignment, every technological advance in the hands of American adversaries is a reminder of the cost of continuing to avoid it.